Urban designer and architect Michael Stepner has worked in the California city of San Diego for more than 30 years. From the city core attached to miles of endless beaches and highways on the coast, to the sprawling malls and hotels that make up Mission and Fashion Valley, in order to get to know Mike, his passion, and his frustration, you have to understand the city he's played such a deep role in designing. Now, Mike has found a calling as a professor in the New School of Architecture and Design, where he's put together a practice he calls the Urban Design Laboratory. Hi, I'm Joe Unger, and this is Pinball Rules. In this episode, we talk about cities and how urban planning and architecture is changing with Michael Stepner. Later in the show, our creative expert Trisha Williams and scientist Sergei Gepshtein will join me to ask how we could take the Urban Design Laboratory beyond the classroom. For now, sit back and enjoy your commute as we find out what it means to design for humans.
I haven't done traditional architectural work for I don't know how many years, but I do a lot of policy work, some design work. I see myself as a connector sometimes of not just the traditional role of drawing blueprints or come into play to shape the built environment. Being an academic, I can play that role.
Why is it as an academic you can, but maybe not a practicing architect?
I think this speaks to the whole idea of the expanded role of all these design disciplines, that they overlap and integrate in different ways, that offices just don't draw blueprints or just don't do buildings. They do other things, and they get involved in everything from strategic planning to graphic design, whether it's a landscape architect or a product designer or a game designer or an architect. All these people will in the future sort of expand into all these areas as part of teams or as the primary focus.
You've referred to the New School as an urban design laboratory.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
A couple of different reasons. There's all sorts of things going on around us in terms of change. New buildings, social issues, environmental issues, all these things. So the students are in the midst of all this. So we can just look out the window or walk down the street, and the ideas that we discussed in the classroom they can see in real life. The other piece of this, though, is a school can assign projects that deal with some of these issues that could be real solutions to the things that they see around them. We've used the term urban design laboratory because we've done work for the city. We've done work for other agencies. But we can do enough to plant seeds about what could be. Students are non-threatening. School is non-threatening. We can plant seeds about ideas about things that can cause people to think later on about, well, maybe that's not such a bad idea. We look at ourselves as a place where we can experiment with ideas about the built environment.
When you refer to built environment, how would you define that?
It's the buildings, it's the streets, it's the public spaces, it's the things that go on inside of them and how they affect the neighborhoods or the community. It's just everything, because I think everything's connected. But the built environment is just the physical things that get built, and it's more than buildings, it's everything that's out there.
In a laboratory, think of scientists around trying to solve a problem or posing a question and trying to investigate.
We are part of something called the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture. Scientifically, they're doing all this research about the impact of the built environment on the brain. On the other hand, there's what we call the applied research. When you build a building, where do you locate the entrances? How do you make it so it's safe and attractive versus just another blob sitting there on the street corner? How do you deal with the land around the building so that it becomes something that promotes people on the street? It's all those things, and a lot of discussion about how you design something, the right mix of uses, the right design of spaces, so that people are healthier. They walk upstairs, have a connection to nature, they have natural light. Are they able to walk from place to place versus having to drive from place to place? We assign projects like that for the students to work on things that really begin to deal with some of these issues.
It seems like there's a shift in the way that architecture has started to look for and look at problems.
50, 60, 70 years, architects focused on the building as an object. Looks good, get it published in a magazine, I'll be famous. But there's been a lot more discussion lately about recognizing the connection between the built environment and the health of the community. What we design is going to affect people in different ways than just providing a space where you can have a 7-Eleven or a Walmart or an office building. The design of livable communities, walkable communities, the smart growth phenomena, all these things are beginning to happen with organizations like the Urban Land Institute. 15 years ago, the whole thing was about golf course communities and everybody having a view of the golf course where they could go out and play every morning. And I think the shift from a lot of developers is, how do we create walkable communities, places where the kid can walk to school? And then the whole idea about how we look at things. With a computer, you can draw 1 million pictures right now. Using some of the game design techniques that you have with games, how do you apply that to the design of a building?
Right, but you're dealing with the same sort of thing, a structure that evokes emotion, a structure that evokes safety or danger. But our pressure was purely narrative.
But all these things come into play, and I think that's where we're thinking more and more about kinds of things that help us tell that story, help us visualize the ideas that we're trying to tell people about that will end up in a new neighborhood or a new building. So I think the need to bring all these people to the table as part of a team is the approach we have to take.
You have everyday exposure to the next generation of architects and urban planners. Do you see that happening with them?
Well, I think you're seeing students who really feel a lot differently about things. They're looking to the experience of where they live and how it really creates that quality of life. And I think it is changing. I think even though we're seeing discussions about retrofitting the suburbs and that people going back in and saying, I want to make it more walkable. I want my child to pass the popsicle test. Provide housing that I can move into that's not a 5-bedroom house, close to a place where I can walk to. I think that in a place like San Diego, where we're going to grow by 1 million people, and we're going to need another, I'm using Sandag's figures, we're going to need another 333,000 housing units by 2050. They've got to go somewhere.
I guess, where do you see that pressure coming from?
At the request of the planning department, we were asked to look at Mission Valley. The core problem is congestion and the development that's occurring in Mission Valley. The planning director wanted us to look at it, but we're just a bunch of people who are just looking at what could be. Mission Valley is actually very underdeveloped. It's mostly parking lots and overly wide streets. The developer, Ernie Hahn, who developed the Horton Plaza downtown, it was his shopping center. And he argued that, number one, he didn't want all that parking, that the standards for parking he felt were excessive, and it was designed so that the day after Christmas, everybody would come back and exchange their gifts, so you needed a space for everybody. And his feeling was that was changing, that because of the continuous Christmas season, you don't need all those spaces every day. And he wanted to first build some garages, and second, to not have as many parking spaces. And so he did, he went through, did all these studies to prove that, you don't need all these parking spaces. And he said also because at first he built a bus transit station, and then the trolley was coming through. And he said that was another reason for not having to have all those parking spaces. The developer's going to come in and say, we got this demand for 500,000 new jobs and places for them to work, and all this new housing. We have all these empty parking lots. You let me build more, increase the intensity. And I think going along with that will be public services and other things, and it'll be close-in housing. You have to improve the transit, you have to change the way that some of the roads work. But you can make it a much more walkable community, and it'll meet a demand for people who don't want to live 20 miles out because of the cost of driving, the cost of energy, the cost of infrastructure. I think we're going to see these trends happen over the next few years.
Right. Even if I want to go from store A to store B that's in the same complex, I have to drive. I think the other day I literally drove a half mile down so I could make a U-turn, come back around, and cross the road.
If you try walking across the street, 6 lanes wide, the walk signal will go on, and you'll be lucky if you make it through the first lane before the walk signal turns to the red hand and starts ticking off the seconds. And then you'll trot a little bit at the end because the light will have already turned red. The way some of those intersections are designed, it could take you 12 minutes as a pedestrian to wait for a light cycle that will let you cross the street.
In an era that I can call Amazon and have that thing that I was going to go drive down to Fashion Valley and go buy at my doorstep tomorrow if I'm willing to wait 12 hours for it, seems like it's out of date already, even though those roads were only put in 5 years ago.
Well, it is, and there's a whole bunch of studies that have shown that the way we design those roads, we don't carry traffic all that well. You have to sort of reorient the way we think about these things, because they all seem counterintuitive because we've been just going in the past by more lanes and more width, and makes it harder for pedestrians to operate.
It almost seems that data got us into a world of highways that humans have no place in anymore.
Yeah. A lot of it is really, sort of, you thought the world was flat and you'd sail off the end if you were Christopher Columbus, 500 or 300 years ago, whatever it is, 500 years ago. We discovered that perhaps the world isn't flat. And we're discovering that this whole movement towards cars and moving everything based on the car has only created congestion. It has not created the kind of neighborhoods that we want. And so there's this rethinking that's going on. The highway people and the road people are still sort of locked in what it should be based on the 60s. And I think it's sort of been proven not to be the case.
So is that voice getting louder in the laboratory? Is that something?
I think it is getting, it's, as I said, people like the Urban Land Institute who used to talk about design of shopping centers and design of golf course communities, they're now talking about how you design livable neighborhoods. They have 10 principles of smart growth and public health that they've talked about. They're doing a lot of work with their organization about promoting different things, changing the mindset. And I think that, it's evolutionary. It's not going to, tomorrow you're not going to see it happen all of a sudden.
Right. It seems like a concrete design problem to solve is the car versus people.
One of my clients was San Diego State University. They bought a whole bunch of land along College Boulevard between Montezuma and where it starts to slope down to I-8, and some blocks on either side of that. And they want to redevelop those for student housing, offices, school-related facilities. And so they went through this whole process. This is the reason they hired me to combat it. They went through this whole process, and the traffic system said that all this development they were proposing was going to generate so many trips, and that in order to deal with those trips, they had to widen College Boulevard. And when it turns out, with the amount of lanes that they had to widen, they lost the land they were going to develop. So, it didn't make any sense. And then they went through the analysis, and it didn't make any sense either. They were arguing that the students who lived on one side of College Boulevard and had classes on the other side of College Boulevard would get in their car in the morning and drive across College Boulevard, park the car, go to a class, drive back to their apartment, and do that again another couple times a day. Nobody was going to actually do that. There's no reason, no common sense to try to drive across the street to find a parking space in a place like San Diego State. So the whole modeling system, which fell apart, it didn't make any sense.
It seems we're on this knife's edge, and we design to the numbers, highways, and modeling. How do you address that in the school?
You just go by some computer printout that says A, B, C, D, E, and you don't think it through about what does it really mean? What is it telling you about real life and how it balances? You're going to do the wrong thing. And I think it's not completely intuitive. You can't just say, I like that, so I'm going to design it that way. And it's not, the computer told me I had to do this, that, and the other thing, follow it like a checklist. There's got to be a way of having the experience, the expertise, the knowledge to translate the data into something that really relates to the human experience. So you can use the data as a tool, not as the means or the end in itself. It's just as a means to an end. And it's a struggle because it's easy. It's easy to say, the computer told me to do this and that's all I have to do. You've got to find a way of injecting that human value into it and the human experience, especially recently with this whole thing about big data and being able to project where traffic's going to occur or where the next delay is going to be on the street system coming in. It's all well and good, but maybe we also need to think about, well, maybe you shouldn't have had to drive there in the first place. Maybe you should have taken the subway or a train. It's more than engineering. It's the art and the human experience that has to be fed into the equation. One of my favorite quotes is by Albert Einstein, who said that not all things that can be counted count, and not all things that count can be counted.
How is that different from your time coming up through school? And
somebody else was going to think about some of these other things. I go back. I remember when I was in school, and this goes back a long time, the book by Jane Jacobs, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, had been out for a while. It was in the fourth year working on a project, and there was a lot of things she said in there that I thought made a lot of sense. I still use it as a textbook. And my instructor looked at me like, why are you wasting my time? What are you wasting my time in class telling me these things? That's not what we're about. That's not what we're supposed to do. And it was just a different mindset that was very technical, very focused on what was the current thinking about design. and how you go about it. It just was entirely different. I thought it had to do with dealing with cities and people in a different way. Always you were designing a building that people were going to work in or live in or whatever they're going to do, but it wasn't, that was just a given. You were going to design this wonderful thing, it's going to look beautiful, and of course you don't want it to fall down, so you had really structural things, but the experience, how it fit with the neighborhood, how all that stuff really wasn't part of the conversation. It was a macro look, or it was a fixed idea that the building was the object and that's all that mattered. And we were never going to go anywhere because this whole thought about continuing the pattern and preservation and scale was not something that was considered appropriate design. So that thinking changed, and here I think we're much more open today to different approaches. There's no one solution, but you really have to take into consideration all the factors that really should influence the design process.
You've gone through a lot in your career, from education to architect to city architect. You've seeing the future through that lens and having that experience. What would be your greatest fear and hope and worst fear?
Well, my worst fear is we just keep doing things the way we've done it because it's easy. And, just look at things on a project-by-project basis and just approve, modify, and just let it go ahead. My best fear is we really start to look at things as part of a context, how they fit, how we're addressing much more than just, I'm a developer, I own this piece of land, and I want to build an apartment building or whatever it may be. And then we start really looking at in different ways at who's part of that team. What are the things that shape it, and who really needs to be part of that discussion? The community, definitely. They are the ones who are going to have to live with everything when it's all said and done. But what are the other disciplines that need to come in to help us tell the story or help us understand what we're designing as the appropriate solution to the problem, and understanding what the problem is in the first place that we're trying to solve? It's more than just, I want to build an apartment building on a parcel, but I want to add to that whole community and help the community evolve to be a better place or stay the way it is as a great place. So I think designers are going to have to really think about those things more so than they've ever done before. It's going to be part of the process that the community is going to fight them tooth and nail if they don't think about those things. And it has to happen. It's just, if we want to see things get built, if we just do it the same old way, that it's just not going to be acceptable. And it's broader than that. The city's going to have to really look at, we as a community are going to have to look at how we pay for things as well. We are $4 billion in the hole with public facilities and services in the city because we're very cheap. We're going to have to come to grips with that we're going to need parks. We can't have the sewer breaking every other day in the neighborhood. We've got to flush the toilet. We've got to figure out how we're going to recycle more water so we can have more water. Walk across the street in Fashion Valley. I mean, all those things are going to be issues that are out there that we're going to need to address, and it's going to take a different way of thinking it and looking at this stuff than we have in the past.
In light of that, and in light of all of your experience in going in and creating this laboratory, what do you tell your students your definition of a designer and the definition of design is?
My definition of design is really creating changes in the built environment, but doing it better than it has been done in the past. I tell them that they really have to really think about different things, that they're practicing a social art as well as a technical art. They have to think about health and well-being of the people who are going to be influenced or impacted by whatever we design. And they have to understand that they have to engage with people, because ultimately the client is going to be the people who are going to live in the building or live around the building or the neighborhood that you're going to change that they live in. So I tell them that they really have to be all those things and listen. And listen is the critical part. What are people saying? What are the issues that people are concerned about that you have to address as part of that design process? You need to be able to talk to people about whatever it is you're going to do, because you're a storyteller, and the drawing itself is not going to be sufficient. You've got to put words to it. You've got to verbalize it. And so that's what I tell the students. They really have to understand those skills, that somebody as part of their team is going to have to really understand that in order to get something accomplished.
We just got done listening to Mike Stepner and what he had to say about the built environment and utilizing the urban design laboratory. I guess, what do you guys think?
Well, he hit on several very interesting topics. We have been trying to understand some of the issues that we discussed in that podcast.
What issues in particular?
In particular, things that are moving. We are never staying at the same location, and even if you observe the same object for a while from the same point, your experience is dynamic because you're looking at different parts of the environment.
Trisha, I know that you've done a lot with building environments like that in digital space.
There's a rule for building a game world that I think transfers into the real world, is that players never look up. When you put things like a cue or something that they need to notice or some sort of tutorial, you never put it above the player's main point of view, the horizon line. Especially when you're walking or biking. When you're in your car, you see further ahead of you, but when you're just walking around, people don't look directly above their head. That way, when directions, you're trying to look for a sign or you're trying to look for something that you need for a spot or a pinpoint, it needs to be somewhere around that horizon line in order to see it.
Is there something in our way that our brains process visual input that we want to look down and in front of us instead of looking up, that we ignore that space?
Well, certainly, our brains are specialized. Just think of the enormous world, so many objects and possibilities out there. We need to allocate these resources to so many potential objects that could come up at any moment. So the brain is very good at figuring what's important and allocating neural resources to where they are going to be used. The buildings, all objects of relevance to us, they normally appear in the lower part of the visual field. So our ability to tell details of the object, these details are much better processed in the lower part of the visual field than above.
Does that have anything to do with sort of protective evolutionary ideals? If you were going to be attacked, it's usually by a mammal, a land-ground mammal, or that's what you're hunting. It's not a whole lot of death from above throughout history.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's exactly the idea. That is, the more important things happen in the lower part of the visual field.
Especially when you're trying to train someone in interactive space to look up. Because a lot of things are fantastical worlds. We create characters that crawl on the ceilings. A lot of the places they can jump to are really up high. And at the very beginning of the game, you put in a lot of different tutorial elements to get them, to train them in the first 10 minutes to look up. I'm wondering if what sort of professions actually echo that same sort of ideal.
Yeah, when you're trying to optimize the location for a door or optimize traffic, really that visual field comes into 100% play all of the time. So it seems like architecturally you'd be dominated by what's directly in front of you.
Things appear at different planes, at different distances from us, and we experience this dynamics differently, whether it is presented on a two-dimensional screen in front of us, or if this happens in the surrounding three-dimensional world.
Now, a lot of our GPS is in our car. You're not looking around, you're not looking up at the signs anymore, you're now looking at your tiny little dot that's going down on this virtual streets that's inside your car. So you're looking down, but it changes the way that we're looking at the world and what level of horizon that we are constantly looking at.
Can imagine how in the near future we'll have augmented reality.
Yeah, and that will probably to the sort of rules that we build with inside games right now. It's going to be the same rules, only applied to the real world.
And in game space, we see more and more people like Mike come to game designers and game artists and ask questions about how we solved those problems. But all of us are trying to seemingly solve some of the same issues.
Basic principles are similar, but certain things are definitely different, such as the fact that your visual input is filtered through the grid of the screen in the head-mounted display.
Yeah, you also can build in things such as cues. If you're wearing some sort of AR glasses and you need to see some sort of sign, it's going to be blinking up in that top right, telling you to look up and to the right. There are a lot of notifications that you can turn on and off to help you notice the world around you and see the things that you're looking for.
And in fact, this difference between the two-dimensional mode of representation and immersive mode, this distinction becomes very important these days because much of the design that we talked about, it's done in what we call cinematic mode, when the designer is looking at what he's designing in a two-dimensional.
Right. Well, it's a lot easier to put a narrative out there in a, even though it's built, like you said, it's built in 3D, it's still a 2D visualization of it. It's like you can point it towards the camera of whatever side you want it to see. It's easy to, when you also control what the player can look at or the camera is looking at, you only have to show one side. It's very similar with movies as well. You don't have to do the backside of the mask or whatever it is because you're only looking at the front. When it's going to be built into the real world and the player can actually walk around these 3D objects, it's going to be a lot more work to present any sort of narrative through physical spaces or objects around.
It's a very familiar concern. Built environments are special cases of immersive environments. In stage design, you want to combine the three-dimensional layout of the scene with two-dimensional decorations, paintings, which are positioned at different distances from the audience.
Yeah, because the audience is sitting in one direction from the stage, usually.
That's right. The viewer is static, and the things are moving on stage, including the stage itself, the actors. But
yes.
Now with the immersive design for games, for example, you have these elements of stage design, but now you can walk through it.
Right.
It is all of these spatial arts are coming together at once.
I think that's where it's starting to be a really good combination of the 3D space plus sort of the 2D UI overlays that are going to be coming in with a lot of AR. And it already is a little bit with your phone. When you hold your phone up to some of the more interactive element, it'll bring up a cue or some words or some text or even a bit of a directions. That will be much more overlaid into our actual world. Even if you're watching a stage play, hitting a button can bring up information on the actor or whatnot. These UI elements that usually have been reserved for video games and websites are going to be in our daily world, which is going to help us navigate through 3D spaces, which I think will actually affect architecture quite a bit.
Increasingly, those architecture students are starting to have to rely on social scientists, on video game designers, on neuroscientists, on artists that are able to represent things in 3D space. That all of these disciplines, particularly when it comes to the built environment, are starting to have to merge together and hand off disciplines, but work collaboratively more and more so.
Yeah, absolutely.
How all these senses come together to create the sense of what we experience as the world, quote unquote.
And what technology we rely on to, get all of that information as well.
Yeah, and how to do it right. Remember, last time we spoke about multiple meanings.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is exactly the same issue. When you translate from one mode to another, you generate new meanings. The experience is different.
Right. When you go from a 2D cinematic space into a 3D built environment, you actually experience the same.
Exactly, and literal translation is impossible.
Pinball Rules Podcast is recorded in San Diego, California, featuring your hosts Joe Unger, creative commentator Trisha Williams, science commentator Sergei Gepshtein, audio direction and original music by Michael David Peter, and production assistance from Laura Rapaulski. For more information on our guests and downloads, go to pinballrulespodcast.com. Pinball Rules Podcast is a copyright of Pigeonhole Productions 2015.